Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are, whenever it is, we're glad you are here. Thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Nasir. I'm joined by James Valliant, the prolific James Valliant. James, you are everywhere on the Ayn Rand Center UK these days. And it's great to see all of the shows that you've been doing, participating in the Daily Objective and the weekend study groups. You are a busy man. James, how are you doing on this fine Wednesday?
A little breathless because I'm so busy, but I love being busy. It's better than the alternative. But I'm doing quite well, sir. How are you?
I am well. I am well. Doing my weekly show. You think, man, he's got his own show. He must be busy. Yeah, it's one show. It's 1 hour a week. You are the man. And we are, as always, on Wednesdays discussing Leonard Peikoff's answers to his podcast questions from the volume Keeping It Real. Well, these conversations have gone really wide, but this volume covers everything. I was just remarking on the socials lately. I love Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. We have here on the bookshelf. I love the ominous parallels. His work in the dim hypothesis is amazing. And then all of the course understanding objectivism and objectivism through induction. But if you want a quick, wide-ranging, practical, well, keeping it real, this is a great volume. It's made for a great series. And James, today you have picked some great questions. Now, diving into the gray zone, that sounds kind of gray. But it turns out, no, this is, I quoted earlier Ayn Rand's The Cult of Moral Grayness. And she makes the point that even in cases where people do appear gray, well, they're not gray, they're mixed. And it's crucial to pick apart the blacks and the whites and the various colors. And that's what we're doing in this discussion this morning. So, James, you picked some great questions. I want to dive right in with the first one. But first, I'm not going to dive right in. I'm going to say we are on the Ayn Rand Center UK, where you, James, are doing all of this great work, where I get to participate as well. Folks, if you are watching live, you can participate too. I want to see you in the chat. I want to see your comments. I want to see your questions. I'd love to see them stand out by hitting that $sign in the bottom. Make them into a super chat. All of those funds go to support the work that the ARCUK does. If you're not a member already, there's a membership link right at the top. Let me dive into that first question. James Valliant, you chose this now as the first question of the day, and I'm loving it. Is it ever moral for an artist? Folks, you can apply this to just about any domain, but this is really going to apply to and we've got a lot of them out there. You writers, you artists, we have graphic designers out there. Is it ever moral for an artist to create a work that does not hurt others, but violates his own basic standards in order to keep from starving? Or is it really better to work in a quarry like Howard Roark did in the Fountainhead? That's a great question, because we all love the Fountainhead and we understand Howard Roark's dilemma. And what was it that drove him to the quarry? Not just that he couldn't do his work his way, but that he specifically was reaching the point where he couldn't continue to function without a great commission, and he got a great commission. The opportunity to build this beautiful bank building. This was going to be magnificent. It could have been the end of the story. Is his career established?
Right.
But as in this question, the folks who wanted the building also wanted to modify his design, to put a classical facade on top of this beautiful building. What do? Do you take the money so you can keep working? Or do you go work in a granite quarry or in one of the trades like Howard Roark worked when he was young? It's a tough one. Here in 2023, we see that all the time. It's a mixed culture out there, and it's not like we can always find a job, or especially as an artist, commissions that exactly suit our artistic beliefs, standards.
Well, Robert, we have a gray title, and as Ayn Rand correctly points out, gray is just a mixture of the white and the black, because what you got out there is black and white, and sometimes they do come in mixtures that make it look kind of blurry between the black and the white. But I have to be honest, my motive in putting these questions together was kind of a dark one. And the first title I proposed was a rather black, if I can choose the two colors, was a rather black title. The truth is that our culture stinks in many ways. And as objectivists, we're constantly observing how our culture and intellectual life in America has become, in Ayn Rand's words, bankrupt. And more than that, the government has absorbed and taken over more and more and more of the private sector. And as that happens, I mean, the economy right now, what truly inspired me is the economy right now sucks. And the political prospects in the two major parties do not inspire, are not terribly inspiring from an objectivist standpoint. So what do we do as the world goes south on us? What do we do as both the culture and politics makes it more and more difficult, creates these contexts where we will have these kind of moral choices? And the truth is that the issues become harder and harder to resolve. More and more, we are maybe called upon to do or participate in something that we may consider to be gray. When does that become intolerable? When do we say, I can't do it anymore? When do we say, in fact, I'd rather do something else altogether than participate in this thing as it's becoming darker and darker on the gray spectrum, if you understand the analogy. But that is a sort of a grim reality that people have to face. But objectivism does provide some guidance here, as usual.
Yeah, I'm ever the optimist, but you're right. I've got to be realistic and say when I point out, oh yeah, but there's Van Dam Academy. In fact, there's all the Montessori, there's higher ground, there's all these professors who are objectivists in schools now. Then I have to remember, well, but that's, 0.1% of what's going on out there. And it is true that people are facing these challenges. I want to get in my profession, but my profession's a mess.
And consider how much government has taken over, say, really important areas like healthcare and education, like you point out. I mean, some of the most rewarding work. If you ever talk to, doctors or nurses, you ever talk to serious educators, these people are committed to their work. They love their work. They're passionate. They're doing something of extreme value. And those are because they're perceived as extreme values, the government is more and more taking over those areas. And so some of the most virtuous people, some doing some of the most wonderful and rewarding and challenging work out there and important work out there, are facing these challenges more and more, unfortunately. But yeah, we have to see what we can do here. We have this life, and we have to make it the best we can under the circumstances.
Right.
How do we do that?
Yeah, and to some extent, where there's a will, there's a way. Let me read part of Leonard Peikoff's answer to the question, in which he says, I would say that in actual life, a quarry is not the only alternative. There are other jobs, there are other fields. There's the possibility of doing your own work part-time. In a dictatorship, starving may be necessary, in which case, well, anything goes. You can do whatever you want, but you're doing that because you're giving up on life. You're just trying to barely get by. In a free or semi-free society, I would say do not violate your own standards. Now, let's suppose, though, that there's no place else you can go, not even another country, and there's no other work. I would still say you should not do it. If we are talking about basic standards and you're an artist, then that action would necessarily be self-destructive. You would be training your mind on the deepest level to shunt aside your values, your understanding, everything important to you about art in favor of automatizing and making part of your mental equipment that which you regard as junk or evil. That is something so harmful that it is very doubtful that you could ever recover from it after working that way for a length of time. I close the quote there, because that point of automatizing, of making it part of your mental equipment, I think people don't fully appreciate what operating under bad standards, lousy standards, and bad thinking do to a person. Oh, I can just distort my own mind in whatever contortions it takes for a month or a year or 5 years to get by, and then get right back on track. It's the old question of, why did Howard Roark tell Peter Keating it was too late? At some point after 5 years, or in that case, 20 or 30 years of producing junk by junk methods, how do you bounce back from that?
Yeah, there's an amazing moment in We the Living by Ayn Rand, where Kira is talking about she's living in that dictatorship that Leonard just mentioned there. She is literally, like everyone else in Soviet Russia at the time, were becoming enslaved. And they asked Kira why she wanted to be an engineer and build her shining bridge. She said, it's the one profession where I wouldn't have to lie. Numbers are numbers, she says. Steel is steel. By the way, is Ayn Rand's first literary formulation of A as A in any of her literature. Steel is steel and numbers are numbers, says Kira. And engineering is the one profession where she won't have to lie. Now think about that. She's living in a dictatorship. And as we move more and more toward, and that's a grim topic, I know, but as we move closer and closer to a dictatorship, we have to engage more and more in that kind of thinking. We have to, for example, when I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted to be a trial lawyer and have that fun in court. And I wanted to be a prosecutor because I wanted to be the guy that put away the bad guys. I wanted to know that I was doing justice. But when I had a choice between, say, being a federal prosecutor and a state prosecutor, now it's at the state level where they do most of the murders and the kidnappings and rapes and theft cases. In the federal level, what kind of things are they doing? Tax cases, immigration cases, antitrust cases, securities and exchange law like insider trading. And I thought to myself, the stuff that the federal government, if I were to be a prosecutor at that level, I would be effectively an agent of evil. Effectively an agent of evil. And it's true that there are things that at a local level that public prosecutors do that are unpleasant for objectivists. Nonetheless, most of what they do, so much of what they do is valid and good, and you are protecting people's rights and protecting them from physical force and coercion. And so I could morally justify that even if the system wasn't perfect. I could work within that system to do justice as well as I could. And that's the kind of thinking sometimes we have to engage in as the world gets grayer, darker on the gray spectrum, if you will. It's a hard thing to do sometimes, to make these choices, but you will corrupt yourself. Had I taken a job at the federal government, and that's the point Leonard's really getting at here, it would have corrupted my soul. It would have corrupted the integrity of my consciousness. I would be automatizing, all kinds of dishonesty and evil just to attempt to do these jobs. It's not just that I would be doing bad to the world, it seems to me, and an agent of evil. I would be destroying myself, destroying my own soul. I could not make that my living. No, sir. To use Kira's phrase, any job which requires you to lie is one better think twice about before you take.
That's a fascinating distinction. And the first I've heard that between the idea of practicing law at the state versus the federal level, but it makes perfect sense. And yes, even when you are prosecuting for crimes that shouldn't be crimes, they often involve, violence, actual violations of rights, even if it starts off as something that should have been legal, drugs or sex trades. But that's an amazing, I probably should have thought of that before, but you're right, at the federal level, what you are prosecuting are things that shouldn't have even been considered crimes. And yes, years and years of doing that, of course, you'll eventually make the argument so many times you start convincing yourself, yeah, I'm really doing the right thing.
Say you're an artist and you're really good at, say, colorization, and you really know your hues and you just love that and the science and art of it. And then someone says, would you be willing to go make my socialist propaganda posters for me? And you say, well, gee, I have this opportunity to use all my color techniques and make these posters really all just swell and beautiful. But you really have to think about the integrity of your soul. You really do. What am I doing? What am I actually doing here? What am I employing my talents in the service of?
Right. Shout out to Apollo Zeus in the chat, who is sending a little love our way. Thank you very much for that. Very much appreciated. I'd love to see a little more activity down there. The chat is quiet today. It's that late summer times when a lot of folks are listening after the fact. If you are watching this video later, you can actually hit the $ afterward and leave a super thanks after the fact. Had a couple of those recently, and they are very much appreciated. See those comments after the show. But I also love the folks watching live, love the chat. So yes. And Leonard Peikoff goes on. He gives the example here. He says, I tried to imagine if someone said, Well, it's an academic requirement that you write your book, The Dim Hypothesis, his last big book, from the perspective of Plato. What would he say about the various topics? Well, if you don't, you won't get your degree and you'll starve. Leonard Peikoff says, I literally would not be able to do it. My mind would go blank because I'd be trying to think of how could I explain that Plato is just one of the wrong alternatives if his viewpoint is in control of the writing process. Unquote, he points out all of the contradictions there. But again, and as he says, it's even worse if you can do it. And then you try to snap out of that.
Right. Much worse that you're capable of doing that. Much you think it through. That's the great advice my dad gave me growing up. And what great advice for a single phrase in my head from my dad that he kept repeating through my childhood. Think it through, Jimmy. Boy, the best advice a parent can probably give a child is those simple words. Think it through. Think through what you're doing. Don't put those blinders on, because that, I think, is the only thing that would make it possible for someone with moral character to do something that's so violative of their principles and standards.
Right. Now, those of you who've ever played the devil's advocate, you'll be familiar with this. Sometimes you do so well that you convince yourself, maybe that side is right. Maybe there is something to that, even though you know better. So I totally get what that does to one's own mind. Leonard Peikoff's answer to that one is fairly long. If you have access to the volume, I'll let you read the rest of that. But I want to get to question number 2 here. Leonard Peikoff was asked on his podcast, given the current political climate in the healthcare industry, should a young person be encouraged to become a doctor? Doctors are already abused enough. And right now, it looks like they might be outright enslaved. Now, this was asked in November of 2009. We all remember Obamacare was being pushed through at the time. And this has been a long progression. Of course, Leonard Peikoff addressed it in his essay, Healthcare is Not a Right. He's addressed it in Medicine, the Death of a Profession. So he answered the question like this. He said, I would not recommend that anyone become a doctor today. The government is clearly going after, again, this is November 2009. And so you can imagine what was going on at the time. The government is clearly going after the doctors. They're going to be one of the earliest professions to be crushed down. The government, by the way, is doing this not because they want desirable results, but because they know it's going to crush doctors. It's pure act of nihilism. However, having said that, if a person has a passion for medicine and nothing equal in his life, knows fully all the intimate risks of the future, well, what else can he do? What can he do except go into medicine and maybe prepare an alternative sideline, as in when medicine becomes impossible? There is no philosophic solution if the alternatives are, well, you have to eat poisonous mushrooms or starve. Well, what should you do? That is a situation that ambitious doctors, and not only doctors, are in. Unquote Leonard Peikoff. Impossible decision, impossible question, but you do the best you can in the circumstances.
Oh, Leonard Peikoff was raised by a prominent Canadian doctor. His father was a physician. His brother, Michael, was a prominent Los Angeles physician. He comes from a family of medical doctors. And there he is. So he knows a lot of people in the medical profession. He grew up with them. And literally they were friends and relatives his whole life. And here he is saying, today it's getting so bad, I would not, all other things being equal, I wouldn't even recommend you go in to the field of being a doctor. And I can think of few professions more important than medicine. Honestly, they're one of the top important, and I can think of, honestly, from the inside, it's not my thing, obviously. My mom was a nurse and she would have loved nothing more than for one of her kids to go become like many mothers, she would have loved nothing more than for one of her kids to become a medical doctor. Alas, we had to disappoint mom. But what an important profession. And here Leonard is saying, I wouldn't recommend it, all other things being equal, unless it really is your distinct, your thing, your ultimate passion. Nothing else will do. Then you've just got to put on maybe the full the full protection suit, the detox the hazmat protection uniform needs to come on as you consider even wading in to a profession like that. But if you are prepared to do that, boy, you really have to hold your nose. But be aware that even there, if you become an agent of evil, you've got to, like I say, think it through, Mr. Doctor. I had the most wonderful physician. He took care of my wife and I from the late 80s to the next 25 years. And when Obamacare and all that started coming down, he simply quit. I can't do it anymore. I can't. The paperwork is already half my job. Complying with regulations is already half my job, he explained. And we lost a wonderful relationship with a physician who retired early precisely because of these things. I don't mean to drag people down with these grim stories. I don't mean to depress people, but here was a terrific family doctor who really cared about, and he was concerned about the whole health of the person. He's a really terrific doctor with a great bedside manner, terrific professional understanding of the field. And here he is forced out because he doesn't want to spend most of his time being a government bureaucrat, satisfying some set of regulations. What a horrible situation. Now, if you can stomach it, and there are still doctors out there. I've still got good doctors out there, by the way.
Yeah.
And guess what? They are still committed to what they do. They still find selfish rewards in what they do. They hold their nose and put up with it as much as they can. They don't become direct agents of evil. Of course not. But on the other hand, they're doing the best they can in a really important, valid function out there, medicine. It's just that the government has made it so hard. You spend most of your time complying with the stupid regulations and the red tape and the paperwork. And can you imagine wanting to heal people and you end up spending more of your time on that kind of stuff than you do actually caring for your patients? These kind of difficult situations are existing more and more in our society, unfortunately, as the government takes over more and more of our economy. But there we are. It's not a fun situation. It's not an easy solution. As Leonard says, there's really no philosophical answer here as we approach more and more and more a total takeover of healthcare by the state. What can you say?
Well, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel my best way of looking at it is we're halfway between the world of the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And so I still admire the Dagny Taggarts, the Hank Reardons, the people who are keeping the wheels of the world spinning.
Absolutely. And as the world presses down harder and harder on those heroes, they keep fighting and work. There are Dagny Taggarts and Hank Reardons out there, and they're the ones keeping this world going. Amen, brother. And boy,
Yes.
what heroes. It makes it all the more important for us to recognize and to praise and to honor those people who are holding the world on their shoulders as the world presses down on them harder and harder, if I can use Miss Rand's analogy.
Yes. Well, we have another super chat from Apollo Zeus. He owns the chat today, and he says, opinion on the essay, The Cult of Moral Grayness. Well, I mentioned it earlier, so you know my opinion is all positive. In fact, I publicized this episode with a quote from that essay. Ayn Rand writes, there are, of course, complex issues in which both sides are right in some respects and wrong in others, and it is here that the package deal of pronouncing both sides gray is least permissible. It is in such cases that the most rigorous precision of moral judgment is required to identify and evaluate the various aspects involved, which can be done only by unscrambling the moral elements of black and white. Close quote, Ayn Rand. So, you know, my opinion of the essay, I think it's crucial because it's so easy to say, oh, well, that's complicated. People are complicated. Nobody's, all good or all bad.
All the more important, it's not in the clear-cut cases. There are cases in this world where it's, really clear-cut, yes, no, black, white, on, off. No. Those are the no-brainers. Ayn Rand is saying, no, when it gets more difficult. It's when it's in the mixed cases, it's in the cloudier cases, the grayer cases, that it becomes more imperative that we separate out the white elements from the black elements and know what we're talking about here. That is actually the best practical advice for guiding oneself through an increasingly gray world. Keep your own, in your mind, the white clear from the black, so that you know what is what, the A from the non-A, the yes from the no, the on from the off. And when you've got that worked out yourself, and you know what's right and wrong, what you're in it for, what your values are, what you're doing there, then you can have some clarity about, no, I won't do that. No, that's my limit. Or no, either we change that or I ain't doing it. And boy, I've had situations in life like that where I've been able to identify, but for this element, right, it would be a good thing, or but for that element, it would be a bad thing. And that gives me the roadmap on how to negotiate that situation. Okay, if you want me involved, that's got to go. If you see what I'm saying, when you have it clear in your own head, the good from the bad, then these situations of grayness suddenly become navigable.
Yes, yes. Yeah, they can be navigated. It's well, it's a point that comes up in the next question that you've outlined for us. Question number 3, do you think it is wrong to work for an employer who does not share your values in life? Now, I'm a healthcare professional, and I refuse to produce work that is substandard, which I am asked to do. So I kind of 2 questions there, and Leonard Peikoff starts off his answer this way. He says, well, this is another example of the perennial question. I want to be rational, but the world is irrational. What should I do? So here the answer depends on what you mean by substandard. With the government being in control and about to freeze out all competition, well, the work is going to be substandard in some ways. It has to be less efficient. It'll cost more. It's going to make the patient wait longer. It's going to make certain treatments prohibitively expensive and so on. I don't think it's wrong to work for such an employer if you can't, I don't think it's wrong to work for such an employer if you can't accept those conditions, if you still believe you are doing some good work, albeit not the great work that you could do in a free system. In other words, I don't believe that where a perfect boss or job doesn't exist, well, then you should just quit. You should decide the balance. If you're not doing anything against your convictions, but you're simply not doing the great work you could do, and you have no alternative or no other desire, well, then I don't see anything wrong. Then real quick here, he says, contrast that with a situation in which, well, you work for an HMO and you're told in effect, we don't want your patients to get this prescription, say, no matter what happens, or it doesn't matter that these tests are too expensive. Or, well, he needs an operation, but our funds are gone. In this case, you have to not just do the right things slowly and inefficiently, but take part in an operation designed to withhold proper treatment. That, I would say, you should not do. That, I would say, is wrong. Then you are becoming part of the perpetrator of the injustice rather than just part of the victim. Now, that's interesting because, well, in this medical example, unquote Leonard Peikoff, in this medical example, we think the patient is the victim. But in a sense, you're the victim as well. You are the victim of this situation. And it's not just you have a lousy boss, you have a government that is making lousy bosses.
Exactly. I mean, the doctor is doing the job because he or she is doing it because of their standards, because they want to deliver health. If they're not doing that, why be the doctor? Why go into the field? I'll give you an analogy. I told you I couldn't be a federal prosecutor, but I could be a local prosecutor for moral reasons. Now, there were aspects of my job that I totally disagreed with. Aspects of criminal procedure, for example, I totally disagree with. Take, for example, the exclusionary rule that keeps out evidence, that excludes evidence, say on a murder case. Evidence would be excluded if the police acquired it and technically violated some principle. Now, should evidence be excluded because it was taken in violation, say, of the Fourth Amendment? Well, in most cases, I don't believe in the exclusionary rule. I think the jury should have the evidence. They should decide it. We should punish the cop for doing wrong in his collection of the evidence. Yeah, but that's distinct from the evidence for the murder. So in most cases, I oppose the exclusionary rule. But that was the rule. And so even though that meant some criminals might get away with it, more criminals would get away with their crimes, I could still work within that system as best I can, fight to get the evidence in as best as I can, because I'm the guy fighting to get the evidence in, usually with that exclusionary rule being the prosecutor. So I wasn't an agent of evil, even though I totally was forced to do, in effect, substandard work, not get all the murderers that we could get, for example. That would be the effect. On the other hand, I'm still working to get as many of the murderers that we can under the law. So just complying with that aspect doesn't turn me into an agent of evil. And that's the kind of distinction, though, that you have to make here, and that Leonard is asking the doctors, for example, to make. If you really are being compelled to give poor quality health care, what the hell are you doing there being a doctor in the first place? That's when you have to stop and say, no, my whole reason for being a doctor has now been pulled from under me. And I can't become, quite as he says, part of the problem. And boy, sometimes that's a hard line to draw and to understand. But I think that's conceptually the kind of line so many professionals these days have to draw.
Excellent. That's a great topic. James, someday, I don't know if it will be on this show, if we can find enough insights from Leonard Peikoff, or another episode of another show, but that topic of the exclusionary rule and how that applies, for example, in wartime. You recently talked about the Geneva Convention and rules of war and so-called just war. I love the point you made that in a rational context, I would love to call it just war if we're talking about justice. Right. That term has been unfortunately taken by people for whom it means pretty much the opposite.
Well, sure. Just like the philosophy of positivism means we can never know anything with certainty.
Yeah.
So they call a total unjust approach to forget justice and rights. They call that just war theory.
Exactly.
Alrighty.
Yeah. Just as Ayn Rand could have called her philosophy existentialism, but it had already been used by a corrupt, nihilistic, dark philosophy. Yeah. But the whole idea of fighting fair, of rules of engagement, that would be a fascinating topic, because I don't think that there's nothing there, but the way in which we often interpret it. Well, it would be a great show to do, but that's not the show we're doing this morning. This morning, I am jumping to question number 4, and we're continuing on the theme here, because Leonard Peikoff was asked, well, what should a small business owner do if his customers promote his business in a way he doesn't want to be associated with? Man, I see this a lot in the clubs, in rock and roll music. How many of your fans are out there smoking dope and talking about your music in ways in which you're like, that's not what I'm doing at all.
Not what I'm doing at all. And so there's nothing worse than being misunderstood and loved for that misunderstanding. It's almost worse than being hated for
exactly.
Right.
Now, the questioner has a much more charming example. He says, my friend owns a small local brewery, and his customers are promoting it as an ethical alternative to the evil giant corporate breweries. Yeah, we're against big beer.
Big beer. Right, exactly. Stick it to Anheuser-Busch. Stick it to Heineken. I see.
Exactly. And it seems like you could either kind of cling to, I don't want to be associated with those people, I need to do something about it, or be totally dismissive. But I get the question. I see how this applies to a lot of different fields. And to start Leonard Peikoff's answer, he says, my answer is very straightforward. Quote unquote, your customers' views are not your responsibility in the least, not even proper to your interest. Your friend is not sanctioning the ideas or the values of the people who buy his beer. He's merely trading them beer for money. Now, there's no implication whatever in an economic trade that you agree with the customer. Otherwise, any business would be literally impossible if you've got to know the customer's beliefs before you can morally trade with him. Well, what if he holds bad ideas? Suppose he says, your beer is good, and I'm glad. I think there should be as many breweries as possible, big and small. Well, then do you say, oh, okay, now I can sell it? Not necessarily. Suppose he then says, and that's why I think some of the really giant automobile industries should be broken up and turned into breweries. That way there will be more of them. You're gonna have to start running. I love this line here from Leonard Peikoff. You're gonna have to start running background checks to see what the person has believed all his life. I love
Check
this.
their
You're gonna
Twitter,
run
check their Facebook and Twitter to make sure they have, or their X these days, to make sure they haven't said anything, dubious, philosophically dubious over the last 30 years. Okay,
right.
that's hilarious.
And if you do, and if enough of that happens, eventually the government's going to demand background checks on beer purchases.
Beer purchasers, right?
That's great.
He makes a really, really good point. Obviously, take the doctors that we've been talking about. He's there to help them with their health issues. He can't, what their beliefs are, their religious beliefs, their political beliefs, whatever the heck their beliefs are utterly irrelevant to him, to his work. Similarly, as a prosecutor, I didn't do background checks on my murder victims or my rape victims, because they were the victims. It does not matter. And in fact, it wouldn't matter if in effect, the bad guy in this murder case was doing something that was angry at something, for example, that the person had done, and I have even the slightest sympathy for what they did. It's utterly irrelevant. It's utterly irrelevant. Once they commit that crime, violate those rights, my job as a prosecutor kicks in, regardless of the person's opinions, who was right and wrong about what, whose politics or religion was what. That's utterly irrelevant. Similarly with a brewer. See, in most of these cases where people perceive a problem, there really is no problem. The fact that my product is being used, I mean, if you sell it, whatever you're selling, whether it's computers or matchboxes, your customers could look, hey, I should not sell matches because some people are arsonists and set fires, burn down buildings with people in them. No. You can't control the match, how this person's going to use a match. There are all kinds of valid uses for matches, lighting lanterns and campfires and whatnot. And so you can't, as the match seller, it would be absurd to say that I'm discriminating against, I have to do a background check to make sure you're not an arsonist and you won't play with matches and set a building on fire. That would be absolutely patently absurd. Leave that to me, the prosecutor, to prosecute the less than 1% of the guys who use matches to use it for arson and set buildings on fire. That's my job, is to get the arsonist. Your job is to sell matches, because there are plenty of valid uses for matches. And you don't have to worry about who's buying your matches.
Yes. And yeah, we talk about valid uses for matches. It immediately makes me think of gun control. Well, but guns only have one purpose. Yes, but that one purpose isn't murder. There are reasons to shoot things besides murdering somebody.
Right. Self-defense, which is most of the use of guns.
Right.
Factually, most of the use of guns in America is self-defense. And very frequently, they don't have to be used at all. It's simply their presence that prevents the crime. So talk about a total warping of even the factual context about guns when you say, well, guns only have one use.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't mean to change the subject, but it just comes to mind when you say, yeah, we have matches and they're not produced just for burning down houses. They're not even produced for burning down houses. Right. Guns have more than one purpose, and they're not primarily for committing murders. Right.
Nor are they primarily used for committing murders, by the way.
Exactly. So let me jump to question number 5. We're rolling along today, but you gave us a long list here, so I'm glad that we're covering these quickly. I love this question. Do I provide a legitimate and valuable service if I continue to be a tax accountant? Now, to me, the answer to that one is immediately obvious. And Leonard Peikoff gives a very short answer. He says, in one word, yes. You are the bodyguard of the producers of wealth. You protect them so far as possible from the vandals and the Huns who are trying to destroy them.
My God, yes.
If you are good at that, you are a hero.
Heroic job. Yes, exactly. When my tax accountant tells me, hey, you missed it, it's something you could have taken off your taxes. Let me catch that deduction or exemption for you. I am on my knees. business expense you didn't realize was a business expense. I'm on my knees thanking the tax accountant. He's doing a heroic job because, again, the tax laws are so complex and Byzantine, the ordinary person can't keep up with them. Now, talk about an evil situation. The government has created a situation where you got to calculate how much you owe the government in income tax, and heaven help you if you get your calculation wrong. It's up to you to calculate how much you owe them, and you're in trouble if you miscalculate. So, and they've made the laws so complex that you need an expert to actually know what is a valid business expense or what is a valid deduction or exemption. It's gotten so complex that you need an expert, and those experts are heroes. Now, in my experience, a lot of tax accountants are pro-tax. I have a personal example here. My wife, her father, that's what he did. He was a really good tax accountant. Now, when I would talk about taxes with him, he was left of center, and he would always you owe the taxes. He was definitely on the you morally are obliged to pay your taxes, and he's very much left of center. And he was concerned taxes could get more. Helped his business anyway. Taxes could get higher and more complex anyway. It would only help business for him. Now, having a father-in-law who politically disagrees with you, now that's an entirely different subject. But the job he did, and he understood that, and I actually had the conversations with him too. You are, though, helping your customers pay as little tax as possible in the process, right? And he would say, well, of course. Everything they're legally entitled to, every deduction or expense they're legally permitted, I'm going to help them get. And it's my job to catch all that. So was even he was doing a noble thing, and I would have happily hired him as my tax accountant if he didn't live in another state, if that all makes sense. Like I say, the bigger problem was having a father-in-law who you sort of avoid the topic of politics with.
I have intimate experience with that kind of challenge.
Yes.
Absolutely. So that one's interesting because you can kind of see where the question comes from. But then you think, well, come on, of course. And the last question we have here makes me think of that. But as usual, there are more insights here than you would expect. Short question, number 6. Is it moral for an advocate of capitalism to be a member of a union? I know a lot of objectivists who are anti-union, and for good reasons. But I also know that, especially before the unions were as completely backed up and in bed with the government as they are, that there were times when Ayn Rand had more respect for a given trade union than some of the leaders in that particular field. So it's not as obvious as you would think. And Leonard Peikoff starts off his answer this way. Yes, when you have no choice about it. Okay, so these are the kind of union shops where you have to be a member of the union. You have to be a member of SAG in order to write for Hollywood, for example. He goes on. The questioner gives the fact that he's a member of the Teamsters. And I could give the case that I had to join some professional union. The laws from Washington today greatly favor unions and the necessity of employers dealing with unions. The unions themselves have so much power that they control a great many fields, and you cannot function in those fields unless you're a member of a union. So the general principle, I would say, as Leonard Peikoff answering, is if your career is proper field, then it's moral to perform it, even if it's controlled by the government, so long as you can still pursue it reasonably. In other words, as long as you don't have to drive the truck at 200 miles an hour or use some hopelessly unsafe green procedures. If you took the view that if a government seriously influences a career, then you shouldn't pursue it, well, you'd have very few careers that you could find. Yeah. And then his last sentence here is bottom line. You are not responsible if someone is exerting that kind of force on you.
That's correct.
And I wish more folks would take that to heart. I know a lot of us accept that pragmatically and say, yeah, you do what you got to do, and then feel guilty and feel resentful. And believe me, I understand the guilt. I understand the feeling of resentment. I understand the anger, the outrage at the injustice. And you should never fully lose that, but you shouldn't be carrying it all the time either. You should be doing your work, the work you love. You should be doing it with pride and never with the sense of, I'm doing this, it's what I love, but I hate the fact that it's regulated, and feel that all the time. And I say that because I see it. I see a lot of that.
Yeah. And sometimes unions, you are compelled. And the truth is, of course, that our laws are ridiculous in terms of the power they give to trade unions in negotiating, especially with large companies. Our federal laws are insane on that. They're, compelled bargaining in effect with these trade unions. And but sometimes you can't do the job at all unless you belong to it. Now, one good note, one positive note is that private sector union jobs, as a portion of our economy in the United States at least, has shrunk over the course of my lifetime. A much larger percentage of jobs in America were unionized when I was a kid growing up than they are today. There are a lot of open shop laws that now require you to be able to belong to that profession or do that job without belonging to that union. Fortunately, we have reduced the private sector role of unions. It still's there, especially United Auto Workers, as you point out, the Screen Actors Guild. There are still some professions where it's absolutely they're the gatekeepers. And if you want to be an actor in Hollywood, or if you want to be a auto worker in Detroit, the point is you really have to belong to that union, and there's no choice about it. That's not a moral issue if you have to belong to it. Again, hold your nose with it. Hey, if you're forced to belong to a union, as I found, if you're forced to belong to a union, you can be that voice, that fly in the ointment voice saying, no, I don't know. I have to. You go to the union meeting, or you make the union voice. No, I disagree with you. I disagree with your position. Sometimes you can do that. Sometimes it's not wise to do that in some labor unions. But you know what is really evil are government unions. Public sector unions, there's absolutely, even in in an objectivist world, if they weren't these labor laws that force negotiation, unions could be private organizations, and there's nothing wrong with a private organization, so long as it isn't given a legal club like unions are today. I'd have no problem with unions in a private organization type unions that don't have all these government regulations that give them such power. Then I'd have no problem with it. But public sector unions, wait, what? That makes absolutely no sense to me. The idea of these government employee unions, like the teachers unions and things like that, are just pernicious. No government employee union should exist in my mind. It is makes no economic sense. It makes no sense in justice. And yet we're sometimes forced to belong to these government employee unions. And the most you can do is work as an agent of slowing down and destroying their purpose from within. But sometimes you can do that. And that's the only kind of advice I can give you. But it's the public sector unions that are really the biggest part of unions in America, in the American workforce today, as opposed to what used to be these big private industrial unions, which dominated so much of the economy in the past. The power of unions, the scope of unions in the private sector has actually dramatically shrunk over the course of my lifetime. So at least that's a happy note on which to end what has been a somewhat grim conversation. But look at it that way. Not everything is going south. In this respect, something went in the course of my lifetime, believe it or not, on economics, something went in a better direction. Fewer and fewer, as a portion of the total employment out there, fewer and fewer people belong and are forced to belong to trade unions in the private sector.
That's interesting because we're the same age. And so I remember when the unions ruled everything, and quite a few of them were involved with organized crime at the same time. We're all still wondering where Jimmy Hoffa ended up. Yeah,
isn't that funny?
But yeah, when things get better, and a lot of things have gotten better, but we don't notice because there's still so much that's so wrong. I have to say, James, you and I did a great episode entitled "The Curse of Emotional Shoulds." How you shouldn't try to force your emotions. Emotions are products. They should not be considered firsthand. They're not something you should try to try to affect directly. So when I say people should not feel guilty, they shouldn't feel the burden of a profession that is, a mixed case. I don't mean to say that you should manipulate your emotions. The way that you want to change how you feel is to have discussions like this, to seek moral clarity, and eventually, the peace of mind will follow. But don't ever try to force your emotions.
No, your emotions are emotions. And in fact, who is going to have a career and not feel occasional frustrations? Of course, there are going to be frustrations. And in a world that's, with all the economic regulations we have in the United States and Great Britain, of course, you're going to feel all kinds of frustration from that as well. But we cope as best as we can. And one of the essential tools of coping is philosophy, moral guidance. It really is important to check your premises, know your principles, know what is dishonest and honest for you, know what your standards are. Getting back to the question about compromising your standards. If you know what your standards are, if you're clear about your moral principles, then at least you have the compass, the guide to help you through these increasingly Byzantine and complex issues, these complex gray issues we need to navigate between the black and the white elements. And the only way to do that is with philosophy. So if you think philosophy is important and can play that kind of role in your life, then what we do here at the Ayn Rand Center UK, I think is just about some of the most important work being done in the world today, creating a worldwide community of serious students of objectivism. And if you're not already a paid subscriber, please consider it. If you want the complexities and moral burdens and questions to be that load to be lightened in this world, we are the answer. We really are the long-term solution to reducing the kind of problems that we were talking about today. So please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. I think we're doing important work, and if you agree, consider value for value at the subscription level you're comfortable with.
Now, if I can, thank you for that, James. I'm sorry I'm laughing, but I'm thinking about, we're on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel, and coming up next on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel, we mentioned, don't go to the quarry until you're really sure you've done everything you can to be a relatively free agent in the field of your choice. But if you do find you have to give up for a while on your career and go into that quarry, go into that job that you wouldn't otherwise have taken, keep an eye out for that blonde on the horse. You just might meet your Dominique Franken there.
Yeah, see, there's all kinds of gems that can be found in quarries.
That's right. And I can't resist making
that was good.
And the reason is, James, you are on many of the ARCUK shows. Another, probably the most popular host on many of our shows, the great Mark Pellegrino, the actor Mark Pellegrino, has said, yeah, that Dominique Franken, man, I couldn't put up with that. And I totally get that perspective, even though to me,
okay, there were a few red flags, I got to admit.
It's so worth it. Well, different perspectives on Dominique Franken. We've had that discussion before, and we will have that discussion again, but at 12:30. It's 5:30 UK time, 12:30 Eastern. Mark Pellegrino is going to be on, and this is great because it's the Daily Objective, but they're kind of taking a break from the daily news. They're discussing the question of the Meisner technique in acting. Mark Pellegrino, we think of as the host of The Reality Check, his own podcast on YouTube, the host of so many great Ayn Rand Center UK shows, but he's an actor. He's a professional. He's a very good actor, and he's going to be discussing the Meisner technique. The Meisner technique for acting. He's going to be discussing that on the Daily Objective with Daniel Kraus, again, in just over half an hour. And then after that comes the reality show, where we will have multiple hosts and 3 topics. The lead for today is constitutional rights are not absolute. Well, we've all felt that coming out of the headlines, and it's going to again today. So folks, stick around. Ayn Rand Center UK YouTube channel, half an hour. You are going to get to hear Mark Pellegrino and Daniel Kraus discuss the Meisner technique. Again, who do you want to hear talk about acting more than Mark Pellegrino? That's going to be good. Reality show at 6 p.m. UK time, 1 o'clock Eastern. Constitutional rights are not absolute ? We know the answer is not a question mark. We know that's just wrong, but pops out of today's headlines. Going to be a good discussion. James, thank you very much. I feel these gray areas are a little less gray, and that's what folks should be achieving with thoughts about their own career, with your decisions about what you want to do with the production side of your life, with your own productivity. And
Yeah.
we will do this again next week, but I appreciate the conversation. Folks, thank you. Apollo Zeus, thank you for several super chats, your contributions to the Ayn Rand Center UK. And I look forward to talking to you again soon, James.
Take care.